morning, and thank you for participating in the DayAhead Market Enhancement Stakeholder Workshop. This is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. We do have two presentations for today's session. First, James Friedrich, the lead policy developer for this initiative, will discuss the need for DayAhead market enhancements. He'll provide a description of the imbalance reserves and reliability capacity, and then he'll discuss the benefits of imbalance reserves and the relationship to the extended DayAhead market initiative. And then Guillermo Bautista Alderete from Market Analysis and Forecasting will present the analysis that was conducted to show the benefits and impacts of the proposed market design enhancements as part of the DAME initiative. And then we have several other ISO subject matter experts represented on the call, and they are listed as panels to the right of your screen. This initiative is between the straw proposal and draft final proposal phases in the stakeholder process. I'm going to review the policy development schedule here shortly, but also as noted on this slide, we are targeting to implement DAME in fall 2023. As for the schedule, the ISO is planning to post a third revised straw proposal, host a call and solicit comments in the April and May timeframe, and then we'll host another stakeholder workshop at the end of May prior to publishing the draft final proposal in June and July. And then our goal is to take the final proposal to the ISO Board of Governors for decision in September. So we are recording the workshop today. We will post the video file on the initiative webpage where you'll find the presentations and other related materials. And just as a reminder, to please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. We are going to pause throughout the workshop and take questions, and I'll provide instructions for how to raise your hand. At that time, we'll also take questions in the chat. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our first presenter, James Friedrich.
Hey, Christina, and good morning, everyone. This first slide shows the major topics I'll be talking about in my part of the presentation. First, I will review the CAISO's perspective as to the need for DayAhead market enhancements. Second, as it's been a while since we've talked about what is proposed in DayAhead market enhancements, and we expect that some stakeholders on the call today have been participating in the EDAM working groups, but may be learning about DayAhead market enhancements for the first time. I'll provide a refresher of the proposed imbalance reserve product and a refresher on its interactions with the RUC process and the enhancements we propose to make to RUC. Lastly, I will review CAISO's perspective as to the benefits imbalance reserves would provide, both within and without the context of EDAM. Much of this material will overlap with the second half of this workshop, where Guillermo will be walking us through some data analysis his team has conducted to support the DayAhead market enhancements. So I'll try to point out in my presentation places where these topics and the data analysis overlap to help form a connection between the materials. Lastly, I just wanted to make clear the things that this workshop is not intended to focus on. The material I'll be presenting today lays out a high-level vision of the DayAhead market enhancements, its new features, and its benefits. This workshop is not intended to discuss the more detailed design elements of the DayAhead market enhancements. For example, things like market power mitigation or treatment of certain resource types or specific settlement impacts, things like that. Just so stakeholders are aware, we are planning to hold another workshop in late February or early March, where we will get back to talking about the more nitty-gritty game design details in preparation for posting a revised draft proposal in early April. So be on the lookout for that notice in the next few weeks. And also just a heads up that DAME is likely to be one of the topics discussed at the upcoming February 11th MSC meeting. So there's potential for some of this material to overlap with what we present there, especially the analysis portion of the workshop, which the MSC is very interested in. So there will be more upcoming opportunities to talk about DAME on a more detailed level. Also, it's important that we establish that this workshop is not intended to focus on specific EDAM design questions or issues. What we will be presenting today is only a high-level vision of the interaction between DayAhead market enhancements and EDAM, but is not in the scope of this workshop to go much further than that. Of course, this workshop may initiate more detailed thoughts or questions related to EDAM, and we hope that it does. but we would hope that those questions get resolved within the structure of the EDAM working groups for the benefits of all participants of the EDAM stakeholder process. So again, you know, high-level questions about the CAISO's vision about imbalance reserves and how they relate to EDAM are more than welcome, but if it's not in the scope of this workshop to get into more detailed EDAM specific design issues than that. Okay. And then I just want to, my plan for questions, Christina, I will, participants can feel free to enter the queue at any time, and I will pause after each slide and check in with you, Christina, if there's anybody in the queue. As long as we're on schedule, I'll stop and take questions as they come up, but I'll make sure that if we're running a little behind, I may defer questions to the end. So feel free to jump in, Christina, if you see questions in the queue between slides, I can go ahead and take those. Okay, great. First slide, please. Okay, so the DayAhead market enhancement intends to address challenges presented by the transforming grid. First, we are observing that DayAhead net load uncertainty continues to grow. This can be seen in the data by comparing DayAhead net load forecasts to real-time net load forecasts. And as you'll see in Guillermo's presentation in the latter half of this workshop, there's a large variance in these estimates. This high variance presents risks in DayAhead operations as to the uncertainty in the level of load anticipated the next day. The reason for the uncertainty growing is that the fuel mix, both on the supply side and the demand side of the grid, has more uncertainty as it is more dependent on weather for the energy source. This is created by both an increasing quantity of grid-connected renewables and behind-the-meter resources like rooftop solar. And of course, weather conditions themselves are becoming more uncertain and extreme. So not only does that affect renewable forecasting, but also load forecasting. And it's important to note that these patterns and conditions may not be unique to the CAISO, but common across the West. The changing resource mix is also putting additional strain on non-renewable generation with DayAhead schedules that are less constant and more varying across the day, and with a need for ramping capability to balance supply and demand when renewable resources are coming on and offline, especially during the morning and evening ramping periods. This is the infamous duck curve as it has become to be known. In a previous Dame-Straw proposal using data from January 2017 to March 2019, we showed that almost 50% of 15-minute market intervals had ramp rates that were steeper in either the upward or downward direction than the scheduled hourly ramp in ISM. Next slide. So this slide intends to demonstrate what we mean by uncertainty. Each of these vertical blue bars represents the start and end of an hourly interval. The very faint dashed black lines that stretch between the blue lines represent hourly schedules, and the solid green lines represent 15-minute schedules from the real-time market. Now, since there is a granularity difference between the hourly DayAhead schedules and the 15-minute real-time schedules, there is going to be some natural separation between them. In other words, if you could forecast exactly the average value of the 4 green lines within 1 hourly interval, you would still have imbalances from the hourly DayAhead schedule. In addition, you can imagine that each green bar comes with some level of statistical uncertainty. My AirPods died, so I have to change. Okay, can you still hear me okay? Sorry about that. So the strong dotted black lines above and below each green line represents the degree of statistical uncertainty for each 15-minute value. And at any point within the hour, the net load can reach as high as the highest dotted black uncertainty line and as low as the lowest black uncertainty line. In the day-ahead time frame, the imbalance reserves intends to cover this amount of uncertainty. Next slide, please. So this slide just simply shows that because of the granularity differences between the hourly day-ahead market and the 15-minute market, there can be steep differences between 15-minute intervals that exceed the ramping provided by hourly schedules. So you can see in this chart that there is a faint black line that connects the first and second hourly intervals, and that represents the hourly ramp that's provided by hourly schedules. So in the IFM assures that there is sufficient ramp to go from one hourly schedule to the next. But in the 15-minute market, if there is, there can be instances where the load comes in higher just because of the granularity difference, and then the ramp that's required to go from one 15-minute interval to the next 15-minute interval can exceed the ramp that was scheduled for in the IFM. Okay, so today there does not exist a market product that addresses the day-ahead uncertainty and ramping needs I just described. Instead, CAISO day-ahead operators are using out-of-market actions to procure the additional capacity they need to alleviate this uncertainty risk. Specifically, operators are making upward adjustments to the load forecast used in the residual unit commitment process. And you may hear this process referred to as RUC-net short in other venues, and I'll be trying to call it RUC-net short or RUC adjustments in this workshop. Guillermo will be presenting data on the frequency and magnitude of these adjustments, but I can tell you they're happening on a systematic basis. The fact that operators are needing to resort to systematic out-of-market actions signals there is a gap in the CAISO market design. The team working on day-ahead market enhancements policy recently met with CAISO day-ahead operations team to understand the logic that they are using for RUC-net short adjustments. They used RUC-net short to cover a variety of risks between day-ahead and real-time. First, the most obvious need is to address risks presented by load uncertainty, and this we think would be addressed by the imbalance reserve product. So today, what operators do is if the day-ahead load forecast comes in over a certain threshold, they will use what they call a max confidence load forecast, which is essentially the 100th percentile load forecast to consider their RUC-net short target. So you'll see in the later presentation that Guillermo's data will show that they often use this max confidence forecast as the RUC target. Sometimes they adjust less than they adjust the RUC forecast less than the max confidence forecast, and every so often, but infrequently, they adjust it a little higher. So why do they sometimes adjust a little higher? Well, there are two other risks that day-ahead operations considers. One is the replacement of contingency reserves that are dispatched for energy in real time. So if capacity that's held for contingency reserves is needed to be used as energy in real time, those contingency reserves need to be replaced by other capacity. Sometimes operators will use RUC adjustments to procure more capacity of this nature, but it tends to be infrequent and on very high load days. The CAISO actually used to have what were called replacement reserves as an ancillary service in the early 2000s, but stopped needing to procure it when the real-time must-offer obligation came about. So on very high load days, when it looks like the real-time must-offer obligation isn't going to get much additional capacity, the operators may consider using RUC adjustments for this purpose. The second risk that they may consider is, or they may consider using RUC forecast above, or adjusting the RUC forecast above the max confidence forecast, is what we will call one-off contingencies. And one-off is just a term that our team uses to describe it. It's not some official term, but essentially what we're meaning is it covers any unforeseen risk that might jeopardize real-time supply beyond what's covered in contingency reserves, such as risks that wildfires take out critical transmission lines, et cetera. So these are used on a as-needed basis, and these types of RUC adjustments RUC adjustments for this purpose don't happen very often, but it is important to our operations team to maintain their ability to use RUC adjustments as a tool to procure additional supply for these reasons if they're needed. So that being said, we are confident that the imbalance reserves will address at least the everyday use of RUC adjustments and their primary use, which is to cover load uncertainty. Any questions in the queue so far?
Yeah, let me just remind people, if you do have a question, select the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you'll want to press #2 on your phone. And it looks like Jeff Nelson's in the queue. And Jeff, if you could just also state who you're affiliated with, we'd appreciate it.
Hey, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. It's Jeff Nelson from SCE.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. How do we ensure that if you buy capacity, that the energy is not exported out of California, the energy behind the capacity? I mean, replacement reserves were dysfunctional. The ISO bought capacity, and then people exported the power, and then basically the ISO had to buy the power back. So if we're buying this capacity, how do we ensure that it's not the energy is not exported out of California? Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And are you talking about imbalance reserves being exported out of California, or capacity secured in RUC exported, or a combination of both?
Yeah, basically any capacity that you've deemed is necessary to ensure reliability in California. How do we ensure that energy is not exported out of that capacity? But the immediate question was, how does the imbalance reserve ensure that the capacity stays in California all the way through real time?
Yeah, hey, this is Brad Cooper. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, good morning, Brad.
Yeah, hey, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, interesting question. You know, we can't assure that energy from imbalance reserves stays in California any more than we can assure any other energy DayAhead stays in California, but DayAhead exports are now in the real-time market at a lower priority than load in the real-time market. So to the extent we're short in real time, those exports are subject to be curtailed in real time. And one point about the imbalance reserves is that additional amounts that we're reserving in RUC today, that happens after the IFM. So we clear exports in the IFM, and then RUC reduces them. With the imbalance reserves in that same situation, the export isn't scheduled in the first place.
You broke up a little, but I think I got it. I mean, just so you know, right now we have the concept of priority exports, right? And in order to get those priority exports, you have to basically identify a non-resource adequacy unit to have that priority. And it seems to me there needs to be an equivalent that if we're buying imbalance reserves, that basically that capacity needs to be treated effectively as RA capacity effectively. And again, exports seem to they need to be not using that capacity, but if they want this absolute certainty, they need to be identifying non-RA and non-imbalance reserve capacity to have priority.
Good morning, Jeff. This is George Angelovich from the show. Can you hear me?
Sure can, George. Good morning.
So, Jeff, maybe I can help answer this question. For the DayAhead market, we do not schedule capacity that is awarded for providing these services like imbalance reserve, we keep those two separate. Although we co-optimize the products, whatever capacity from a resource is awarded as imbalance reserve, let's say, that capacity for imbalance reserve up I'm talking about is not going to be dispatched or scheduled as energy. And then it carries a must offer obligation when we go to real time, so that the scheduling coordinator must submit an energy bid to cover that capacity so that it is dispatchable in real time. So in the day ahead, obviously that capacity is not exported because it's reserved. It's not scheduled as energy. Now in real time, I think your question probably pertains in real time. What happens if there is uncertainty materializing somewhere in the system, in the energy imbalance market footprint, and this capacity is dispatched as imbalance reserve, as dispatched as energy now to handle some uncertainty, right? So you're asking how we can make sure that this dispatch is only for the needs of the California ISO. Is this your question?
In a way, yeah. I mean, if we're paying for this capacity,
Okay.
how are we sure we're getting it when we need it?
Yeah,
And I mean, designing something that risks curtailments is not a good design.
Okay, there's an easy answer to that, Jeff. So the capacity, the imbalance reserve that is dispatched in the energy imbalance market is not for necessarily for the needs of the ISO or for the BAA that the resource resides in. The energy imbalance market provides the service over the entire interconnected energy imbalance market footprint, and it optimizes across the footprint for all BAAs that pass the resource sufficiency test in real time. So there is this notion of the EIM diversity benefit that is realized through the EIM. So it's one of the principles of the EIM that uncertainties are covered globally over the entire market footprint. So there was never the intention to have this capacity earmarked just for the needs of California. For the same reason, resources in Nevada or in Bonneville could be dispatched out of their imbalance reserve awards to it will be flexible ramp in the EIM to help uncertainty that materializes in the ISO. So it's a give and take in the EIM, if that was your concern.
No. You're raising even more concerns. Just in the current structure, so we've got to start somewhere before we figure out how this works. But just in the current structure, the current EIM market, if we're to implement imbalance reserves, are you procuring imbalance reserves just to meet the California uncertainty, or are you procuring imbalance reserves to meet all of the uncertainty that you're expecting to materialize in real time through the EIM footprint? Is this for California, or is this for the entire EIM?
It's only for the needs of the California ISO balancing authority area in the day-ahead market, because in the day-ahead market, until we expand it to EDAM, of course, we are only having the California ISO in the day-ahead market, so we're procuring imbalance reserve to cover the needs of the California ISO balancing authority area.
Right, then it certainly should not be available to EIM members if it was bought for California and paid for by California.
Well, we're part of EIM, Jeff. We cannot not participate in EIM. I mean, we procure it for the needs of to make sure that we can pass the test in real time, as the ISO has enough resources committed and reserved to pass the flexible ramp requirements in real time, so that we can be part of the EIM global co-optimization, right? So I'm not following your suggestion here.
This is Brad. It seems like you.
I'm going to go off at this stage. I'm just going to let other people ask.
It seems like there would be the same arguments, following that same logic, Jeff, that RA resources shouldn't be in the EIM because we paid for that capacity.
This is
to the extent they're needed to maintain California reliability, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, this is James.
Well,
go ahead, brother.
Go ahead, Danny.
This is James, and I think I hear Jeff asking a different question than what's being answered, and is that sort of what's the relationship between imbalance reserves and our PT export rules, meaning that, today how we determine what type of supply is eligible to be a high priority or price taker export that has scheduling priority equal or CAISO load, how does the imbalance reserve play into the supply or capacity that's available to be designated as a PT export? That's kind of what I'm hearing Jeff getting at.
Oh, thanks, James. Well, if that's the question, and this is George, then the answer is that capacity awards will never support a high priority export. In the validation that we perform out of the supporting resource for a high priority export request, we're using non-array capacity that is not reserved for any kind of capacity awards. So if a resource has imbalance reserve award in the day-ahead market, that particular capacity of the resource cannot be used to support a high priority export, if that was the question.
Yeah, I'm going back on what I said. I am going to comment. That is part of the question, but it's a larger philosophical. If this product is being bought for California and it's being paid for by California, then it darn well better be available when California needs it. And that means all the way through real time. And I don't see how this design does that.
Okay, and those are all valuable points. And I think when you know, how the imbalance reserve interacts with the PT export rules and all that stuff is definitely within the scope of things that we'll be adding to our next proposal. And you know, we can in our upcoming workshops have more conversations about those concerns.
This is Brad. I just wanted to reply to that. I had another thought. You know, the EIM in real time has a resource sufficiency evaluation. So it seems like if all the BAAs are resource sufficient and passing the resource sufficiency evaluation, then, and I might be wrong about this, but it does not seem like then there is ever going to be a shortfall where we would be exporting power from imbalance reserves in real time that we need, that would make us resource sufficient.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and move on, and we can continue to make sure there's time for questions. So if Jeff, you have any other thoughts to add, feel free to do so. But I'm gonna keep going and pause again for questions. So yeah, so this slide essentially just summarizes that the two enhancements that we're talking specifically about are adding the imbalance reserve product, and also today in the RUC process, we only procure incremental capacity in RUC or additional capacity. In the day-ahead market enhancements, we would propose to also give RUC the ability to procure decremental capacity downward. And we are calling that capacity, both in the up and downward direction, reliability capacity. So reliability capacity up is essentially a new term for RUC capacity today, and reliability capacity down would be a new product. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the characteristics of the imbalance reserve product. So imbalance reserves would be procured to meet uncertainty in both upward and downward direction. So there'll be an upward and downward procurement requirement that is co-optimized in the IFM with energy and ancillary services. The imbalance reserve product would be biddable with separate bids for the upward and downward direction. The IFM optimization will use imbalance reserve bid prices as part of its objective function in achieving an optimized solution. When a resource receives an imbalance reserve award, it comes with a real-time must-offer obligation to provide economic energy bids that cover the quantity of the award. So for example, a 20 megawatt imbalance reserve up award would obligate a resource to provide an economic bid or economic bids of at least 20 megawatts beyond its day-ahead energy award. Imbalance reserve awards themselves are capped at a resource's 15-minute ramping capability. Also, an offline resource is eligible to receive an imbalance reserve award if it has a startup time of 15 minutes or less and can be committed in the RTPD or the RTUC. Imbalance reserves would be modeled and priced respecting transmission constraints, meaning they will have a nodal LMP. This would be done through the use of what we call deployment scenarios. And a similar concept is used, the deployment scenario concept is used to procure flexible ramping product today. And these deployment scenarios essentially model the imbalance reserves as energy flows to ensure that the imbalance reserve awards are fully deliverable and not stuck behind transmission constraints in the day-ahead market. The imbalance reserve prices themselves would be based on both the bids, would include any opportunity costs that arise in the co-optimization between the various products in the IFM. So for example, if a resource, because if we're just looking at energy and imbalance reserves, because those products are co-optimized, if for some reason a resource that would be otherwise be economic to provide energy in the IFM has a cheap enough imbalance reserve award such that it's held back for providing energy to provide imbalance reserves, the resource would be compensated for that opportunity cost of not providing the energy that it was economic for. Because the imbalance reserve products are modeled respecting transmission constraints, there can be a congestion contribution to the price as well. Didn't add that to the slide, but that can be another component. Finally, the procurement requirement for the imbalance reserves will be determined using a quantile regression methodology that accounts for historical load imbalances between day-ahead and real-time and incorporates variable energy resource forecast uncertainty as well. The requirement would be procured to the 97.5 and 2.5 percentile level of expected uncertainty, but we would make those, or we propose to make those percentiles adjustable based on operational experience, and we can make the requirement higher or lower than 97.5 and 2.5 if we needed to. Any questions in the queue or on the phone?
I'm not seeing any yet. James, I'll let you know though if anybody does.
Okay. And yeah, just a reminder, if you have a question at any time, just raise your hand and we'll stop between slides to get to your question. So the imbalance reserve does not replace the RUC process. The RUC process has a specific purpose in mind. And this slide shows what drives the need for the RUC process, both in the upward and the downward direction. Fundamentally, the RUC process is designed to meet the differences between IFM cleared energy schedules and the CAISO's day-ahead demand forecast. But there can be differences, there can be differences in the IFM schedules and the RUC demand forecast in really three major ways. One is that bid and load can clear differently than the CAISO's load forecast. So if bid and load clears less than the CAISO load forecast, that drives the need for reliability capacity up because the expectation is that the forecasted level of load would come in the next day, and because the cleared amount of load is less than that, there will be higher load need in real time than in the day-ahead market. Therefore, you need upward capacity in RUC. The second driver of the differences between IFM and RUC can be how virtual bids clear the market. So if the market clears with a net virtual supply position, meaning that more virtual supply is cleared on the system than virtual demand, that also drives the need for reliability capacity up, because those virtual awards essentially are replacing the physical awards in the IFM and therefore the reliability capacity up procures additional physical supply to backstop the virtual awards. And lastly, there can be differences between how variable energy resources clear in the ISM based on their bids and how their forecast, their forecasted output in RUC. So the RUC process utilizes adjustments to account for differences between variable energy resource schedules and their forecasts. So if the variable energy resource fleet clears at a level greater than the CAISO's forecast, that's the need, drives the need for reliability capacity up, because essentially we assume that in real time they will operate to their forecast, and thus we need additional supply to cover that. If the VERS clear less in the ISM compared to their CAISO forecast, then we assume that they're going to be producing to their forecasted level, which is higher than they were cleared for, and therefore drives the need for reliability capacity down, because we're anticipating additional VER output in real time. Okay, so this slide shows, and then actually the next three slides will provide a diagram that shows how imbalance reserve interacts with the RUC process. Okay, so this slide is an example where there's no RUC needed, so it's a simplified process. This will rarely occur, but it's helpful to just distinguish the concepts. So this green line, or this green bar here, is the ISM energy schedule, and we're assuming there's a purple line that sort of intersects between the green bar and the blue bar that represents how the ISM clears compared to the RUC. Now, the wording here says cleared non-VER physical supply equals CAISO net load forecast. So we're assuming here that all three drivers of the RUC, both the load forecast compared to the cleared bid-in or the cleared bid-in supply or clear bid-in demand, the virtual position, and how variable energy resources clear relative to their forecast are all either zero or they net to be zero. So in that case, the cleared non-VER physical supply is equal to the CAISO net load forecast. In this case, what would happen is we would procure imbalance reserves up to the blue line, which is the upward uncertainty requirement, and therefore that blue bar represents the additional capacity procured above the energy schedules that's reserved for uncertainty as imbalance reserves up. And then from that purple line downward to the red line, the downward uncertainty requirement represents the imbalance reserve down product. So next slide, please. Now in this slide, we are showing how the imbalance reserve product interacts when there actually is capacity procured in RUC. And of course, the imbalance reserve product is procured before RUC, So the RUC supply is actually in addition to the imbalance reserve capacity. So on the left-hand side, we have ISM. You have some cleared level of some cleared physical supply or some cleared energy schedules in ISM. You procure up imbalance reserves up to the blue line and down to the red line in the ISM. And then when you get to RUC, you find that, okay, our CAISO net load forecast is higher than the cleared non-VER physical supply. And so that drives the need for reliability capacity up. And so the RUC would procure additional supply represented by that purple bar. And then the last slide, or the next slide, is the same concept, just in reverse, that in this case, we're procuring imbalance reserves in the ISM, and then we still have a need for RUC supply in the downward direction because our net load forecast is lower than the non-VER physical supply, and then we're procuring downward capacity represented by this purple bar on the right-hand side.
James, we do have a question in the queue.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Ready to take? Okay. Kira, go ahead and open up the sales line, please.
Hey, this is Michelle Kita from the CPUC. So I understand that this would be because the net load forecast is different, but what about because IFM clears virtuals? Would it also have to cover that?
Yeah, it does, and that's why I'm using the term physical supply in the verbiage, because I'm attempting to try to capture that the virtuals is part of this calculus of needing downward ruck. And so in this case, it's unclear, it's not clear what the driver ruck down in this case is, but it could be either because of virtuals or because of load or VER forecasting driving this. So yeah, it would include the virtuals.
Okay, so, but the purple is CAISO's net load forecast error, I assume, but it could be the virtuals that cleared in the IFM, right? I mean, it could go in both directions.
Yeah, so the three drivers can net against each other. In this case, yeah, it could be that the need for reliability capacity down is all driven by virtuals. Mm-hmm. In this case, or it could be the case if there was if the net virtual position was exactly 0, this purple bar could be represented by VERs clearing lower than their forecast, for example, could drive this need too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
James, we did receive a question in the chat from Kevin Cito asking if you can explain how the imbalance reserve product differs from the flexible ramping product.
Yep, good question. So the imbalance reserve product is procured in the DayAhead market in the IFM. It shares some common features. For one, there's a similar methodology for accounting for its requirements between imbalance reserve and the flexible ramping product. So in the IFM, and for imbalance reserves, the requirement is based on historical differences observed between the RUC forecast, which is the DayAhead forecast, and the FMM forecast, the corresponding FMM forecast of the following day. So that's how the requirements are determined for imbalance reserves. For flexible ramping products, the requirements are determined between the FMM forecast and then the three preceding RTD forecasts. And then for the 5-minute product, it's just the differences between that 5-minute interval and the following 5-minute interval. So it has similar ways of procuring. Also, the imbalance reserves, it reserves capacity that requires a must-offer obligation into the real-time market. It's possible that the energy bids that are used, the energy bids that are supplied based on the imbalance reserve must-offer obligation can turn into flexible ramping product awards. And it's not this isn't the venue to talk about this, but there are ways that those products sort of settle against each other that sort of relates them in that way. So our proposal has more information about how those products settle against each other, and we will, if there's any updates to that, we'll have that out in our next proposal. So hopefully that answers part of your question.
We said thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, I think those are all the questions for now.
Okay. So we're moving along pretty well. Okay. So now that we've kind of laid out what the imbalance product is, we have laid out what we feel are the drivers of the need for imbalance reserves. These next couple of slides will talk about our interpretation of the benefits to imbalance reserves as it compares to procuring flexible capacity through RUC adjustments. So that's the status quo we're comparing against. And this set of slides, the next two slides are kind of organized in the following way. There's sort of two different categories of thinking about the benefits. This slide intends to capture benefits purely of co-optimizing a flexible capacity product in the IFM rather than having it in RUC, rather than getting it through RUC adjustments. The second slide will then add on additional layer of non-zero bidding for the imbalance reserve product as compared to today, RA resources are required to bid $0 in for RUC, and potentially as depending on how EDAM shakes out, in the past we've proposed potential transition periods for RA resources to bid $0 for imbalance reserves as well. So the DayAhead Market Enhancement team feels that procuring capacity to meet uncertainty and ramping needs through an imbalance reserve product has many benefits compared to through manual operator RUC adjustments. So focusing just on the co-optimization benefits here, the most pertinent benefit is that co-optimized imbalance reserves would improve the allocation of system ramping capability compared to RUC adjustments. The IFM will be able to ensure that there's optimal use of ramp to meet both the forecasted movement in the energy schedules between intervals, but also in meeting the up and down uncertainty requirements. That's the IFM could determine the optimal set of resources that are needed to meet the ramp between hourly day-ahead schedules and the 15-minute ramp needed to meet uncertainty. Second, we expect that since imbalance reserves address the primary cause of RUC adjustments, and that RUC adjustments would occur much less frequently and in smaller magnitude when the imbalance reserves are implemented, that means the IFM and RUC schedules won't be as drastically different as they can be today, which means that there would be fewer IFM export schedules that are deemed infeasible in RUC. Third, imbalance reserves as a 15-minute ramping capacity can respond more flexibly and more nimbly than hourly RUC supply can to real-time load changes and ramp insufficiencies. And finally, to put it simply, RUC is not intended or designed to provide flexible capacity. That previous slide I showed with what the drivers of RUC are gets to the heart of what RUC was intended to address, the difference between the way IFM clears and the day-ahead load forecast. So to implement imbalance reserves and reduce the RUC adjustments means that we can return RUC to the purpose it was designed for. And I see Josh has a question, but I'm gonna get through the next slide and then I'll stop.
Okay, thanks, James. And we do have a chat question as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so this slide adds in the additional layer by considering the additional benefits of giving market participants with RA resources the ability to bid non-$0 price for imbalance reserves. So we would expect that imbalance reserve bids would be based on cost to the resource to be available in real time without a day-ahead energy schedule. There are a number of categories these costs could fall into, depending on the type of resource it is, where the resource is situated on the system, and other system conditions. So this slide lists out a few example categories in the sub-bullets there. We believe these costs are not fixed. They're variable costs. They can vary greatly depending on system conditions and resource types. It is the opinion of the DayAhead Market Enhancement team and with support of the Market Surveillance Committee that it is better to compensate resources for these types of costs through a biddable market product than through RA contract payments. First, allowing resources to bid their availability costs allows the IFM optimization to optimize resource availability and unit commitments based on biddable availability costs. $0 bids today do not do that. Second, that imbalance reserve product would shape the real-time must offer obligation based on where and when it is needed. rather than having RA resources provide real-time availability 24/7. So if you can imagine, you know, the RA must offer obligation, you know, over the day represents sort of a flat horizontal line that all resources that are providing RA have to meet. The imbalance reserve would essentially take that flat line and shape it around the day-ahead load forecast, such that on certain times of the day, when it is less likely that those resources would be needed in real time, they don't have to offer a real time, or they don't have to be available in real time for those hours, and presumably there's some cost savings of doing that. But also the imbalance reserve product and its requirements would hopefully be sufficient to cover, you know, what would have been the peak RA real-time must offer obligation of the day. And Guillermo does have some data on comparing the imbalance reserve requirement to the RA supply in his set of slides. So we think it's a better way to compensate resources. We know there are challenges with RA contracting, with potentially the long-term nature of certain contracts, issues with RA market power, et cetera, but still maintain that over the long run, that providing resources these market payments rather than through RA contracts is a better way to allocate payments for flexible capacity. Lastly, this is sort of an aside, but it's possible that implementing the imbalance reserve product encourages more imports to set themselves up to be 15-minute dispatchable. We know that we've heard from you know, importers into the California ISO that you know, a lot of times that they don't have an incentive to provide 15-minute dispatchable imports because of transmission costs and other things, and they're not compensated when they're not guaranteed an award the next day. You know, by providing capacity payment for capacity that's reserved for uncertainty in the day-ahead market can compensate potentially imports for those availability costs, and will encourage those imports to set themselves up as 15-minute imports that can also just have benefits with energy scheduling as well. Okay, so I'll stop there. I see a couple questions.
We'll go to Josh first. Josh, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Is it Jeff from PowerX or Jeff from SCE?
I think Josh Arnold actually is.
Josh.
Josh, are you on?
There we go. Yeah, there I am.
There. Okay.
Thanks. Josh Arnold, PG&E. I actually have a couple of questions from these last two slides I want to bring up. The first thing I want to bring up, however, is your discussion, James, on how the use of RUC towards getting flexibility, and the comparables that have been made through the presentation. And I just want to move back and say that, you know, RUC has never been, as you've pointed out, used for flexibility. That for ramping, that was what FlexRA has been for. So the comparisons between these adjustments and the IR product and all that, they really don't fit to my mind. I think we need the IR products to be compared more to the flexible RA, yes, to the generic RA, but mostly to the flex RA positions, because that hasn't been answered. That comparable, that relationship has not been demonstrated, because that's what California currently has in its arsenal to meet this flexibility requirement, be it for ramping, load uncertainty, net load uncertainty. That's the key metric I think we need to be looking at, as opposed to what the operators are doing in RUC. Because the operators are going to do what they have to do to maintain reliability. Then on your slides, in slide 16, you have a bullet point that this co-optimized product would better ensure IFM exports and schedules. My concern on that is that under certain conditions, especially high-priced, high-value days, high-cost IFM days, this bullet point doesn't fit. Because the IR product has a lower penalty price and a lower bid price than energy, as soon as the SMEC goes above the IR bid cap of $250, those exports would displace IR if exports are self-scheduled. So I don't know that this combination of statements will really result in an effective reliability framework for California. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so
yeah, hey, this is Brad. I wanted to respond to the RA point, but James, maybe first you could explain that last point, because that's not correct. That RAs, that imbalance reserves are procured just up to a price of $250. I think what Josh is leaving out is the price from the scheduling run.
Yeah.
Sorry. I want to clarify. Brad, is the bid price cap for IR not still being considered $250 the same as spin? Because there was nothing. I'm working off that assumption from past papers that there is a bid cap on the IR product of $250. I want to make sure I understand that assumption is correct.
Yeah, but what you're not including are the penalty prices when we go short. Maybe James or Danny or George could jump in.
Yeah, you're right, Josh. The imbalance reserve cap is actually $247. It's like $1 less, like the ancillary services off bid caps that are like $1 less than each other. And imbalance reserve would settle at $247 as a bid cap.
Right.
So this bullet, what this bullet intended to say, and I get what you're saying about penalty prices, and it is an important discussion. But what I was trying to communicate with this bullet is that the RUC adjustments can sometimes be very high. It can oftentimes and because of the way that we've set up our export rules now, where RUC determines the feasible export schedules, that exporters who get schedules and then have their exports cut in RUC, that is exacerbated by RUC adjustments. And so what that bullet was trying to get at is that if the imbalance reserve product was implemented and removed much of the need to do RUC adjustments, then that that would not. There would be much fewer export schedules in RUC that are deemed infeasible just by nature of the sort of the RUC adjustment inflating the load forecast, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I meant to say there.
Okay, so then taking that through, if we are in a situation, let's say it's a high price day, so it's a high load day, if there is, if SMEC is very considerably higher than the $247, if there is a conflict during the final runs, if there's a conflict between a self-scheduled export willing to pay any price to get energy, and a shortage, an internal shortage of IR capacity because of that pricing conflict, because of that order of operations conflict, don't you think the operators would try to restore reliability within California by using a ruck load adjustment to try to make sure?
This is Brad. The example's wrong. When there's a shortage, the imbalance reserves are going to clear ahead of exports under our current proposal. Under our last proposal, even if the exports are priced at $1,000, because we're putting in like a $2,200 imbalance reserve price in the scheduling run. That was, if you remember, our last proposal, PowerX submitted some comments with that situation, explaining how it's wrong that if even if, and then the scheduling run price is quite a bit lower, and they were pointing out the anomalous effect where the $1,000 export wouldn't clear and the price would be set lower, and maybe we could, like James said, we didn't want to get into design nuances now in this presentation, because we actually have a proposal we've been working on internally that we want to roll out in a next stakeholder workshop where we talk about the mechanics of imbalance reserves that corrects that problem. But I wanted to address, Josh, your comments about RA, that we don't need imbalance reserves because we have RA. To us, RA is a forward planning product, which is different than our market where we have products to schedule and commit resources in the market, and RA doesn't get you that. We need, for example, imbalance reserves could start up a long start unit to provide capacity in real time. RA just procures the capacity in advance, so it's available to be get into the market, but we need market products to optimize it. I mean, you could argue we don't need this new market product that we can commit stuff through out of market actions, but nonetheless, RA in itself doesn't get you anything without something to dispatch it in our market.
Okay, Brad, I'm going to disagree with you entirely on that, because with the introduction of FlexRA, that is a product. Flexible RA has a must-offer obligation, a must-offer economic obligation in all markets. All right? That is, in effect, a requirement to bid energy. Energy is a product. Therefore, you have flexible RA, and that's why I keep coming back to flexible RA. It's not just steel in the ground now. My question has been, Brad, what is the relationship between your imbalance requirement and the current flexible RA amounts? That question has never been answered.
Well, I can answer that. The flexible RA requirement is based on the 3-hour ramp concept, which and I believe we've talked about this in the RA initiative, that honestly might be a dated initiative and concept. And one thing we've been contemplating, at least internally, is that at some time maybe the flexible RA requirement should evolve to be anchored more around the imbalance reserve product. But James will get into in a little bit why just pure energy optimization is lacking, and we think there's advantages to the imbalance reserve product.
So basically what you're saying, Brad, is you need a product to support another product. Isn't that just bad market design then?
I'm not following a product to market to a product to
you're saying
such other products.
So what you're saying
is there a number of other ISOs have DayAhead replacement reserves or 30-minute reserves, have reserves to provide energy in real time. And yeah, no, I do not think that a day-ahead reserve product just to have energy available in real time, which is another product, I guess, is a bad market design. No, I don't agree with that premise.
Okay, because I would point out that those locations that have the 30-minute reserves don't typically have flexible RA or flexible capacity requirements in procurement processes. So you're comparing, I think, apples to oranges. And what I keep asking about is, you say you have a need. Great. You've demonstrated that there is a requirement in the real-time market for flexibility and for ramping capability. The question I keep asking, what are we missing from FlexRA? Where is the gap?
Well, I think the gap is, and we'll get into this further in the presentation, the gap is the extensive out-of-market actions we have to take in the day-ahead market to ensure that that flexible RA is available.
If flexible RA has a real-time must-offer obligation, Brad, then your operators don't have to do anything to make flexible RA available. So these adjustments.
What about resources that the real-time market can't start? Real-time must-offer obligations get you nothing from those resources.
Then they aren't flexible RA. They're generic RA. They're not flexible RA. They can't qualify as flexible RA if they can't start in the real time. That is a foundational requirement of flexible RA.
And then the other consideration, and again, I think we're jumping ahead here. The other consideration is RA is a monthly planning exercise. Is it economic or efficient to need absolutely every bit of capacity you've procured month ahead for the peak day of the month? Do you really need that for every day of the month, and want to have those resources line up gas, position their water systems, buy capacity on or transmission on Enterprise each and every day, even though on that that particular day it's virtually assured we're not going to need those resources. But I think we're jumping ahead in the presentation.
Well,
if we can table this a little bit.
I just have one more point.
We have some slides that take this on.
I just have one more point to make, and then I'm going to drop off. And that is that at the end of the day, reliability has to be maintained. That is the operator's objective. That is the RA objective, reliability. And there are costs to reliability. So in your slide, you're talking about, it was on slide 17, if you can move to that. Here we go. Minimal product would allow, where it said it would make flexible capacity available to where and when it needs it. Well, we can guess as to where and when it needs to be there. We can't say for sure. Your forecasts are guesses. The economics you're citing are guesses. What happens when the guess is wrong? That's what RA was supposed to be for. We pay more, so we have more capacity when we need it because the forecast is off. So my concern is in trying to make things more economic, we lose that reliability benefit. And that's why I try to keep coming back to RA, because it's supposed to be for reliability. And I'm just going to leave it at that.
Our intent is to come up with a design that provides the same level of reliability.
So did you have something else, Brad or Josh?
This is James, and I know we have other callers. I'd like to touch on one aspect of the FlexRA part. I think that we see the FlexRA and imbalance reserve product providing some of the same services, but some different services. For example, the FlexRA product does not reserve capacity in the day-ahead market for uncertainty. Even though there's real-time must-offer obligations for energy in both the day-ahead market and the real-time market, the imbalance reserve product withholds reserve capacity in the day-ahead market to be available in real time for uncertainty. So that, to me, that's kind of the major difference. And I can agree that in terms of providing real-time must-offer obligations that are needed for ramping and other things, that potentially there's an overlap there. And so I think it's a good point. I think that there needs to be a longer-term discussion about what the future of the FlexRA product is if we have an imbalance reserve product implemented. Maybe they're both needed. Maybe only one is needed. Maybe the FlexRA product itself can be reorganized around providing must-offer obligations or providing resources that must offer imbalance reserves or something like that. So I do think it's an important, something important that we need to tie up. But I do think that there are features of imbalance reserves that are not covered by FlexRA, even though some of their intentions overlap a little bit. I hope that helps, Josh. And let's see, I've got 15 minutes, and I know we have a couple questions. I was hoping I could hold the questions. I did try to leave myself a little bit of additional time at the end for questions, so I'm hoping I can just get through the rest of the slides. I think I only have 2 more, and then I can do a final call for questions, if that's okay. Within the context of EDAM, we think that imbalance reserves has an important part in EDAM. First of all, the first bullet really trying to get at that all of the benefits in terms of day-ahead market scheduling, unit commitment decisions, optimal use of ramping, reserving capacity to meet uncertainty, all carry over into an extended day-ahead market. This is essentially what that first bullet is trying to say. So all the benefits that the California ISO individually could see from implementing imbalance reserves would carry over into the EDAM. Second bullet, optimizing EDAM transfers, really gets to that the ISM can consider the reserves that are needed based on the uncertainty needs of each BAA, so that, you know, without the imbalance reserve product, the ISM has no way of knowing what reserves are needed for uncertainty, and therefore could be providing unoptimal energy schedules and transfer quantities that don't consider the need for uncertainty. So including the imbalance reserve helps make the actual transfer quantities, because they'll consider the uncertainty needs of each BAA more accurate and more efficient. The imbalance reserve, we think, improves the reliability of EDAM transfers in a few ways. One is that the imbalance reserve product and the imbalance reserve product and the way that we propose to establish its requirements in terms of procurement can be the basis for the treatment of uncertainty in the EDAM resource efficiency evaluation. It's hard for me, at least, to imagine what the basis of a uncertainty needs in the day-ahead resource efficiency evaluation would be without imbalance reserves. And if we didn't have a market product that addressed uncertainty needs, then, you know, it might have to be residual capacity or something else that would be used as the basis for uncertainty. And that, for all the reasons that we've described in the previous slides, would not be an optimal way to do it. So we think that because the imbalance reserves provide the consistent treatment where every EDAM participating BAA uses the same methodology to establish their uncertainty requirements, would improve the reliability of EDAM transfers. Also, that the imbalance reserves comes with a real-time must offer obligation, and that real-time must offer obligation is subject to bid insertion. So that's another way that improves reliability of EDAM transfers, because if you're an EDAM BAA and you are receiving imbalance reserves from your neighbor, you can rely on them to fulfill their schedules because of the real-time must offer obligation associated with the product. And lastly, having imbalance reserves enables trading of capacity to meet resource efficiency evaluations on certain components. So there's potential that you could have sort of bilateral bid range trades and other things to facilitate, and imbalance reserves could facilitate that. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide we've shown it a lot of times, but I think still represents our best attempt at the high-level vision of how EDAM and the DayAhead market enhancements and certain California RA rules interact. So this slide intends to be read from left to right, with the left side being the most in advance, in terms of time, the most time in advance those decisions are being made, and the right-hand side is the most immediate to real time. So on the left-hand side, under forward capacity procurement, you would have the CAISO as a participant in EDAM continuing to be subject to its own CAISO resource adequacy program, and having EDAM participating BAAs subject to whatever their integrated resource plans required by their local regulatory authorities. The CAISO resource adequacy program requires a DayAhead must offer obligation for those RA resources that are those bids are entered into the EDAM. Same thing with the EDAM entities. They're providing voluntary bids into the EDAM that feeds into the DayAhead resource sufficiency evaluation, and then follows into our DayAhead market processes, the IFM, the RUC, et cetera, et cetera. So in the DayAhead market, all of those bids would feed into the IFM. We would co-optimize energy, potentially ancillary services, imbalance reserves. We would procure reliability capacity through RUC. And then if there are EIM participating BAs, but not EDAM participating BAs, they can submit base schedules that form the basis of the real-time resource efficiency evaluation. And from the CAISO and from the other EDAM participating entities, those real-time bids would come from DayAhead schedules. That would be, your energy and imbalance reserves, et cetera. So all of those bids would feed into an EIM resource efficiency evaluation, which then feeds into the CAISO's real-time market processes, in which case we would co-optimize energy and flexible ramping product and incremental AS across the EIM footprint. So that, I think, still is the high-level vision of how CAISO sees all of these things interacting. And I've got about 8 minutes, and I can take some verbal questions, and I think there's a couple chat questions. But at 10:30, I will pass the mic to Guillermo.
Okay, so let's go to Michelle first, and then I see that Jeff entered the queue as well. Okay.
Hey, this is Michelle from the CPUC. So as you know, there's this issue in the EIM resource efficiency where EIM advisory imports are supporting exports in the test. And I'm curious how that's going to work in the EDAM framework. What if non-EDAM imports are supporting the exports and then they don't show up? How would that come into this process?
Maybe I could have George or Danny provide some thoughts, or Brad, on that question.
Yes, thank you, James. This is George Angelides with the ISO. Michelle, you're probably referring then to wheeling constructs where, the import side is an import from a non-EDAM BAA into the ISO tied to an
No,
export.
George, not tied. George, not tied.
Okay.
Imagine that you have
Okay.
you're going to be running the IFM with imports, right? That are from
Yes.
non-EDAM BAA.
Yes.
Those could support
Yes.
exports. So I'm saying
Okay.
we also know that there's import failure. So how are you going to deal with that?
Okay. So as you know, we assign priority to those exports, and the only exports that can get a high scheduling priority, which is the same as our load, must be supported from an internal resource out of its non-array capacity that it's not reserved for a capacity award in the day-ahead market. Any other export, it will get a lower priority, which is lower than our load. So in real time, if it has to compete with our load, let's say an import is serving load and the import doesn't show up in HASP, HASP is obligated to serve our load ahead of those lower priority exports, so it will cut the low priority export to serve our load.
Yeah, this is what I'm struggling with, though, because what you're saying is the day-ahead framework and the EDAM framework are going to become fixed, right? Just as James was saying that the exports will be supported out of EDAM and this day-ahead framework, but you're saying it's not. So I haven't been able to reconcile that yet.
Well, I'm just answering your question, which was not on an import from a transfer, but from a non-EDAM BAA.
Right.
Are you referring? Okay, so.
Yeah, but an import from a non-EDAM BAA could support a transfer to a EDAM BAA, right?
You can say that, yes, because it will be the outcome of the optimization. It's possible that we have transfer exports in EDAM out of the net supply in the BAA, and an import from a non-EDAM BAA contributes to that.
Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So under those circumstances, what happens if the import fails?
And we have a firm transfer export?
Yes.
The firm transfer export will be met, and if we have a problem serving our load, we'll be cutting any low priority exports, not part of that transfer.
Right, but we're optimizing everything. So let's say the EDAM entities take all the exports. What do we do then?
Okay, you mean we don't have any lower priority exports?
Well, yeah, lower priority doesn't mean.
But all of it is a transfer, which is firm.
Right.
We don't have anything to cut, right?
Right.
You're looking at a scenario where we don't have lower priority exports. Everything is exported as a firm transfer out, and then our imports are not showing up.
Right.
Yeah, it's the standard question that we get on what we consider deliverable imports, and I have to rely to my colleagues here to see if this is a real problem we have seen between DayAhead and HASP, that imports don't tag, because I think that's what you're asking here. If the imports don't tag after the DayAhead market, how we can reliably support our transfer exports in EDAM if we can't count 100% on the imports, correct?
Right.
Right. So I don't have the data. I don't know if someone of my colleagues has data to give some insight on how real this situation is. Brad?
Yeah, Michelle, I thought you were talking about was a more specific situation. You know, the fact that exports can clear against imports, you know, this isn't anything new. You know, that's been going on since we've had our nodal market at least. I thought you were pointing out, though, the more nuanced issue of well, I guess it isn't that exact issue. You know, you had pointed out the more nuanced issue where exports clear against advisory transfers, and then then the situation was for some reason then the RSE limited our transfers. We failed, the ISO fails the RSE, and then and our transfers were limited, and then we had the exports, and now this is within the hour, so the export priority is irrelevant because the lower priority for exports is in the HASP, but we then once scheduled for the hour, we support them for the hour, and then then the ISO is left holding the bag, so to speak, to support the exports. We're planning to address that in subsequent phase of the RSE initiative, but just the broader issue of supporting exports when you may when we may not receive imports. I don't think that issue is new, but I think it does warrant further discussion in the EDAM process. When we get into the firmness of EDAM transfers question, because I guess it is a question for the ISO, because we have the fact that our transfers out can be supported by these market cleared imports that I don't know if this is supported by empirical evidence, but some people view as not as firm as the bilaterally scheduled imports that EIM areas have.
Right, but Brad, in the EIM resource efficiency, you guys are implementing a requirement that if they don't tag at T-40, and the data show that you guys think that this is a big deal. So this strikes me as a big deal. So when we run HASP, we're saying those exports are going to be certain, but the imports are not. And then we're going to, in their resource efficiency, we're going to cut the imports, and we're going to still support the EIM transfers. So that's one problem. The second problem is that the HASP runs as if the exports are going to be firm, but the imports are not. That to me strikes me as a problem. And I'm saying that that's a small problem, but move that into the DayAhead, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, Michelle, this is Danny. I think what you're identifying is pretty analogous to the intertie uncertainty adder that we actually have in the EIM RSE. The whole concept would be that imports either that the CAISO has or that an EIM entity shows through the base scheduling process doesn't tag at T20. You're just moving that into the day-ahead timeframe. What if imports that are relied on in optimization don't show up, and who's left holding the bag? In the context of EIM, we had that intertie uncertainty adder, which looked back and tried to determine how big of a problem this is and project going out into the future and ensure that all entities had enough additional capacity to cover that occurring. I think something like that is possible in the EDAM construct, since this problem won't be unique to any EDAM BAA. It'll be a problem experienced by all potential members.
Yeah, and then I just want to add, this is why I also said that the intertie deviation penalty should be considered as part of this entire framework, because the penalty for not showing up, if you get scheduled in HASP and then you don't show up, is only 50 or 75% of the IFM and FMM. So under tight system conditions, you could imagine making a decision not to show up because they can go elsewhere, and the penalty is less than going elsewhere. So to me, it seems like a systematic reliability issue that needs to be addressed, right? Or am I missing something?
I guess I'm now not quite following. You're saying a day-ahead import award from a non-EDAM BAA is awarded and then doesn't show up in HASP, how it would be addressed getting into real time then?
I see. Yeah, I hadn't really thought through this. What I was talking about was the HASP award to real time. And so if you get a HASP award, you don't get charged for deviation. Put in last summer penalty provision that's 50 or 75% of the highest of FMM. Now in the real time, I guess in the day ahead time frame, I hadn't really thought about how you guys would price it. So I guess that's a good question.
So a Haspel ward that's not delivered is actually also subject to well, maybe that's changed now with the timing, with the change to not dispatch once not tagged by 20. But what I was going to say is it's also subject to imbalance energy settlement for 2 of the 15-minute intervals, but that might have changed recently. I got to think through that.
Okay, well, anyway, this is something that I think we need to think through more thoroughly. The other point I just wanted to note is that, getting rid of the must offer obligation. I mean, let's say we run the market and we tell a couple of CTs that they're not needed, they're not picked up for imbalance reserves. Think of all the things that can happen between day ahead and real time. So one of the things that I can think of that can happen is that you could lose a large transmission line. Now, under this framework, we can't ask that resource to turn on to meet our needs. Now, the price might be high enough and they might do so, but we've paid for that resource, to be available, at least from the RE perspective, in the day ahead and the real time. And it just seems like a big miss not to have them in the real time.
So if I understand your question, Michelle, I think each DAA would be responsible for maintaining reliability following the loss of a transmission line. Is your concern that getting rid of the real-time MOO and the CAISO BAA would then remove part of the CAISO's ability to meet that obligation?
Right. I mean, I guess you could exceptionally dispatch them, but or let me just put it differently. Let's say that you've let go of that CT and it becomes a EDM export, right? A firm transfer. We can't recall it.
Okay, I think I understand your concern. And all of this, eventually, I think will have to be discussed in the EDM RSE working group. And I think we have a few weeks blocked off in the process to discuss the reliability of transfers, which will be working through what are all the rules to make sure that transfers that come out of the EDM are covered. And then situations like you're describing where a non-EDM import wheels through one EDM BAA to supply power to the entire footprint, how we might want to account for uncertainty on those imports. I think all of this just is part of that discussion.
Okay. And then my final issue that you guys have already identified is just concern about the idea that we'll be paying additional capacity for this, additional payments for this capacity that were already paid for. I mean, when we purchase these resources, they know they have a day ahead and a real time must offer obligation. And these contracts, as we've said, can be 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So the idea that it's going to reduce RA payments just doesn't necessarily hold water. So while you guys have identified the benefits associated with this, we also have to acknowledge the costs, which would be an additional product that we would be paying for that we will not see reduction in RA payments. So I just think we have to consider both sides. It's really not, it doesn't make sense not to. So thank you.
Michelle, this is and we're 7 minutes over for Guillermo's. I know we have 2 more questions, so I think we can go to Jeff and Tong, and hopefully we can try to keep it kind of brief so we can make sure Guillermo has enough time.
Yeah, let's go to Jeff. Thank you. Jeff, are you still there? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, they unmuted me. Thanks. Okay, so just clarification. It has to do with the real-time must offer. This is just a real quick one, and then a question after. Your proposal is both before and after EDAM that the RA real-time must offer goes away. Do I understand your proposal?
For after EDAM, I think yes. For before EDAM, I think that it's potentially flexible in terms that, we have in past proposals that didn't consider EDAM, had considered a transition period. I think the ultimately we would want to transition for where the imbalance reserves would replace the real-time Mustafa obligation as our ultimate vision.
Okay, can you? Okay, thank you. I'm gonna really ask this sincerely. Can you explain why? Why is it so important that you eliminate the RA real-time must offer? I'm mystified. I cannot understand why you're proposing it. Can you please explain it?
Within EDAM or outside of EDAM, or both?
Both, because it sounds like no matter what, you want to transition it away. Why?
Okay, so so outside of EDAM, the reason why we would have the imbalance reserve replace the real-time must offer obligation is that we see an opportunity to essentially allocate real-time availability on a more let's say granular basis than the flat real-time must offer obligation that's done in RA today, where you're meeting a monthly peak load amount, and all of those resources that are procured for RA in that time frame are required to meet the real-time must offer obligation. When we have over the course of the day periods of time where the real-time must offer obligation is far in excess of the amount of load that's there. And I get that the real-time must offer obligation is intended, its purpose is to cover the worst case scenarios. And we think that the imbalance reserve can, one, on off-peak times, shape the real-time must offer obligation such that not all resources that are providing RA would need to provide a real-time must offer obligation on those off-peak times, which may be a more efficient way to do it. And second, that, and this is something that Guillermo will put in his slides and something that we're thinking about, during the peak times, can the imbalance reserve requirement be equal to or greater than the real-time must offer obligation that was required under the RA construct, such that during those peak times, the requirement that imbalance reserve requires is the same as what we would have gotten under the RA real-time must offer obligation anyway. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I just wanted to hear your view. I don't want to debate the issue, but I appreciate you articulating your view. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And I just want to, under EDAM, there may be other considerations to make in terms of concerns related to, in EDAM context, if California RA resources have a certain real-time must offer obligation that may be asymmetrical with how other EDAM participants are participating in EDAM that don't have a similar requirement, that may create some issues. So I just wanted to add that in as well. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, and I think you should articulate what those issues are. And you maybe don't need to do it now, but you need to articulate them because I'm still mystified.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. I think we can go to Tong, and then we should move on. Hopefully, we can keep it brief because we're cutting over my time already.
Yeah, I have. This is Tong Wu from WAPA. I have two simple questions. One is related to ancillary services. The other is related to imbalance reserve. First, ancillary services. From EDAM meetings, I understood that entities needs to submit their ancillary services quantity, so the ISO can consider that amount in the resource sufficiency evaluation, so that the ancillary service capacity is not double counted. So here I see this under co-optimization. I don't know if ISO intend to co-optimize ancillary services and energy for the EDAM entities outside of California ISO footprint. That was one question. The other question is related to imbalance reserve. Now, in my mind, there are uncertainties before IFM for EDAM and there are a lot more uncertainties after the IFM is done, between the IFM and real time. Okay, so for this imbalance reserve, when you determine the requirement for imbalance reserve, do you consider both of the uncertainties before IFM and after IFM? Now, if you consider both in EDAM, then that could elevate the amount of uncertainty you require and the requirements placed on EDAM entities. Because at the end of the day, these EDAM entities, their BA, they have responsibility for their reliability, operation. Okay, so I want you to kind of clarify these two questions.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thanks for the question. So for the ancillary services question, although it shows up in the slide, it's my understanding it remains an open question whether or not in EDAM ancillary services will be co-optimized across the EDAM footprint. It was just added into the slide because it's that's something that will be discussed in the EDAM process or EDAM stakeholder process. So I think that's still an open question. So hopefully that answers number one. Number two, the imbalance reserve requirement, the basis of the data points come from the differences between the RUC forecast or the DayAhead forecast within a certain interval. So let's say that we're forecasting tomorrow from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. and I have an hourly DayAhead forecast for that quantity at that interval. And then so we take that data point and then we compare it to the 4 corresponding FMM intervals over that hour. So you're going to have 4 observations. You're going to have those 4 intervals and then subtract the net load in those 4 intervals and subtract the DayAhead RUC forecast. And essentially the observations are residuals, differences between the actual forecast in the FMM versus what it was forecasted to be in a DayAhead time frame. So in that case, the uncertainty that we would be trying to address is that occurs between the IFM and the 15-minute market. And then if there are uncertainties that sort of pre-IFM uncertainties, those would have to be worked out in a different way. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, that helps answer my question. I know due to time limit, I'm not going to ask more questions. I may ask those questions in the EDAM meetings. Thank you.
Sure. Or if there's time at the end, feel free, and you can always reach out to me individually if you have other quick questions. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so that concludes my portion, and I'll turn it over to Guillermo.
Thank you, James. Can you confirm that you can hear me okay? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction to this second part of the workshop. This is material that Quinn and myself are going to go through. And the scope of this second part is really to bring some data analytics that we have done regarding the areas of interest for the DayAhead market enhancements. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive analysis. It's the first step towards giving you the facts and the data that can be used to guide the discussion into the DayAhead market initiative. Next slide, please. And there have been several areas that have been discussed in recent past regarding the DayAhead, and that touches the imbalances that James just described, and also the way we are expecting to calculate the imbalance reserve. And in the recent past, there has also been a lot of interest regarding the operators' actions to adjust the load forecast that is utilized in the DayAhead market, and how these components interplay with each other. The presentation covers only a portion of the analysis that we have done. There is more analytics that you can go through by yourself, and that is already available in the report that is posted together with this presentation. And it is in the same site where you can get access to the presentation. With that, let's go through the material that we have for this morning. The first one is, back in 2019, we did some analysis regarding the price formation in the CAISO market. And one of the areas that we identified was related to the errors that happen between the day ahead and the real time. These errors are characterized as load forecast errors, and the basis we use to calculate those errors is the differences between the net loads of the day ahead and the real time. We have the load, the wind, the solar. Each of them are going to have an inherent level of uncertainty, variability. We have this construct of using the net load, and the difference between these two becomes what we characterize as imbalance. This is quite analogous to what we have for the real time, in which we have a flexible ramping product requirement that is calculated based on the net loads. The difference here is that it is between the day ahead, effectively ROC, the day ahead forecast, and the 15-minute market. And the error is going to be attributed in two main components. The first one is the inherent differences between the time frames, day ahead and real time errors in the load and renewable forecast, but also in the granularities, because we are comparing an hourly value against more granular 14 intervals within the same hour. And it is important to clarify that this type of imbalance is mainly tackling the uncertainty related to the load, wind, and solar. As we have discussed two different forums, there are other types of uncertainties, operational uncertainties, that are not inherently captured by this calculation. This trend that you have here is an update to the trend that we provided back in 2019 regarding the imbalances, the errors between day ahead and real time. And there are different points that you can take from this presentation. First, we have the direction. The imbalances happen in either the upward or downward direction. And that means that it reflects the nature that the forecast error can be over forecast or under forecast. The other component that you can see here is that the median, that is the horizontal line in the blank space in the boxes of each plot, is oscillating around zero. And that is a nice thing to see, because you can see that the error, the median of the error is going to be around zero. Now, this visualization also provides some reference on the type of the distribution of the errors. And that is the reason you have these violin shapes that tells you where the distribution is higher or lower. And the dots that are at the end basically are the extremes. These are just a very basic definition of extreme values that are outside the 1.5 times the interquantile range. And you can see, in general, the imbalances continue to happen. They are quite meaningful. In some cases, they can easily exceed 6,000 megawatts in either direction. And it's something that is persistent and is expected to happen basically across the time. Next slide, please. This is the same data that is organized in a different fashion. It contains the same errors, but these are organized on an hourly profile for each month. Basically, all the data points for the months of January are collected together. And this is just to give you a sense how the seasonality could be a factor to consider when we determine the imbalance. And in this case, you can see the typical range of imbalances vary quite a lot depending on the month you are dealing with. They happen to be smaller in the winter shoulder months. They tend to be higher in the summer months, such as August and September. That is when we reach values close to 8,000 megawatts. Next slide, please. Based on that, these are just historical values, the uncertainty or variability that realized, taking into account the historical forecast. part of the discussion of the DIM has been a mechanism to estimate the potential requirement that we could utilize for the imbalance reserves. And as a reference, we have a histogram approach to calculate the requirements for the FRP in the real time. As part of the enhancement for the FRP, we have moved into a more sophisticated approach that we have called the quantile. And the similar methodology is being proposed for the day-ahead market enhancements. And the logic here is relatively simple conceptually. And the idea is that this quantile approach is a regression methodology in which we take into account two sets of data. One is the historical data, just to see the seasonality, the conditions that we have faced historically. But the second component that makes the quantile a better approach than the histogram is that we also take into account the current conditions that we are estimating the requirements for. That effectively means we take into account the current forecast for load, wind, and solar when we have to determine the level of the requirements. And obviously, the imbalances are going to be in either upward or downward direction. And this one is specific to the upward direction. The imbalance reserve using this quantile approach, and you have the distribution here by month, similar construct to the historical illustration. And you can see, based on this approach, we are estimating that if we were to look back in history, at least for the last 3 years or so, the imbalance reserve requirement that we would have used in the day-ahead market could be anywhere up to 5,000 megawatts. There is no very strong seasonality in the maximum values, but if you see, for instance, the box plot that is inside each violin plot, you can see the first and the third quartile. The horizontal line is the median, and you can see that at least the median shows some trend. That trend is that for the upward requirement, that tends to be higher during the summer months, lower during the winter months. And somehow that is explainable and expected given the seasonality conditions that we have to face weather-wise. Next slide, please. This is the same illustration, but for the downward direction. Equivalent to the upward, we have the same distributions. We have somehow, I wouldn't call this a trend because obviously it's a period of 3 years, and things may be changing over a longer period, but at least for the last year or so, we can see that the downward requirements indeed increase. And there is no very strong seasonality condition. It seems that the downward requirement is going to be higher around the winter shoulder months, and June 2020 through September 2020 seems to be a very outlier case when we face these very challenging weather conditions. I don't know, you may recall that around those times there was at least one day, and I believe that was September, when we have an error temperature that was over 10 degrees, and obviously that is going to impact directly how well we can come with a good load forecast. I think this is a good time, Christina, to pause to see if we have any questions.
We do have Michelle back in the queue, so let's go to Michelle first. Again, if you do have a question, select the hand icon above the chat window. If you're just dialed into the meeting, press pound 2.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Michelle from the CPC. Can you just clarify what forecast you're comparing it to? Because there's IFN bids, there's also the CAISO sort of day-ahead load forecast, and then there's a RUC forecast. And it's my understanding that all three of those are different.
The bidding demand is not a forecast. It's a market product that is determined based on the clearing point of the integrated forward market. We don't use that. The RUC forecast is effectively the day-ahead forecast for the CAISO area. That is what we used. In addition to that, there may be a terminology confusion here because sometimes we refer to the load forecast, to the RUC forecast as the adjusted load forecast. That is the day-ahead forecast plus minus any RUC adjustments that we have. In this specific metric, we don't internalize or factor in the rock adjustments. It's only the natural day-ahead forecast.
Okay, so let me understand. So it's just your day-ahead forecast. It doesn't include rock adjustments. So I guess CAISO has made rock adjustments for to get sort of a 75 or 90% of the load forecast, and that's not included. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And did you do it both ways? Because isn't that the kind of thing that we also want to capture as well? I mean, if it's for reliability purposes that you want the resources to be able to cover the day ahead from where you sit, and you're making rock adjustments because you're concerned that it might go there, isn't that what we want to cover? I'm just confused.
Let me clarify your confusion, Michelle. The idea is that the rock adjustment is precisely to tackle in part the uncertainty. But if we want to develop a product that handles the uncertainty, it wouldn't make much sense to still include the manual operator at full because you are double counting for the uncertainty, right? There are two options here. Whether we continue doing the rock adjustments and you handle in that way the uncertainty, or try to come with this more scientific approach to handle the uncertainty component. So it wouldn't make sense to include both together because you would be effectively double counting the consideration of the uncertainty.
So this is the difference from your day-ahead load forecast. So when you said RUC forecast, I guess I got a little confused. And then my other question, is this the net load forecast, sort of like the forecast less wind and solar? So it includes both of those uncertainties?
Yes, it's the imbalance based on the net load. And effectively, net load equals load minus wind minus solar.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And all these details, they are explained in detail in the report, so I would encourage everybody to read the report. This is just a very brief summary of the content of the report. Do we have any other questions, Christina?
That was our last question. Nothing in the chat either, Guillermo.
Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a sample. We took 3 months that may be representative of different seasonal conditions, right? We take the month of January, that is a very heavy winter month. We have the month of May that could represent a shoulder month. That is the transition between spring to summer when the loads are shaping quite differently. And the month of August when we are heavy deep in the summer conditions. And the distribution you can see varies by the time. And if you see the tails, for instance, the lighter blue, that stands for basically the tails of the 2.5 percentiles. And if you take those lines as the reference, we are very well talking about imbalance reserves anywhere in the range of 1,000 to 3,000 on any typical day through the year. And next slide, please. And this is a very granular view of comparing, one, the historical imbalance reserve, just the materialized uncertainty that is captured with the bars in green, versus the estimated imbalance reserve requirements that are the upper and the lower lines in blue. And the idea is to see for this specific case, we have a couple of samples. One is for the critical days of July 8th through 10th to see how the imbalance reserve requirements would work out for these specific days. And the other period is when we have similar tight date supply in early September. And in this case, I think we changed that. It's for December, just to have another sample during a different type of the year. For this one, that is the middle of the summer, we can see that the requirements that were estimated using the quantile regression is relatively good in capturing the materialized uncertainty. There is only one interval at the end of the day when the materialized uncertainty was above the requirements. And keep in mind, this is something that sometimes we take as granted. We're talking about here uncertainty, and uncertainty here in the East with some challenge, right? We will never be able to be 100%, and that is the trade-off we're taking here. The requirements are based still on expectation of meeting certain level of confidence. So there will be cases where the requirements are going to be maybe not sufficient to cover every single instance of the realized uncertainty. This is the other sample for a 3-day, and basically just pick another day where we have a high requirements, and that happens to be in the winter time frame, just to see how it looks like. And for this period, you can see that we have quite a meaningful amount of requirements. It's exceeding 3,000 megawatts in the upward direction. And for December 19 and 20, all the interval seems to be within the range in the upward direction. And there was materialized uncertainty on the 18th that was above the requirements. And you can see still the shape, the trajectory of the requirements tends to track closely to the materialized uncertainty. We're working on posting a white paper that describes all the details and all the analytics that we have for the quantile regression applicable to the DayAhead market. That's something that is coming later. But I just want to show these graphics to give you a sense, an illustration of how the imbalance reserve plays out with the materialized uncertainty. Now, let me change topic. I would like to bring topic by topic and then put them together, because there are different areas that have been discussed in this area of the DIM. One of them is the ROC adjustment. As I explained earlier, we have the DayAhead load forecast. Currently, an operational practice is to use the flexibility we have of ROC adjustments to account for uncertainties that operators have to factor in. This is what we call the ROC net short, the ROC adjustments, and we provide that information on a daily basis during the summer months. And there is an enhancement to come where we're going to be making this available on Oasis. Now, this is the history of how the ROC adjustments have been for the last 4 or 5 years. And there are several conditions here to explain. The first one, obviously, is that the volume, the frequency, and the magnitude of the ROC adjustments have increased over time. There is no doubt. And you can see as early in 2017, these were very sporadic, scattered points here and there. As we progress through the years, now it's more systemic and it's more utilized. The other point that you can appreciate here is that there are these blank zones between summers. And you look at, for instance, between September 2019 through, I would say, March, you can see that effectively there are no ROC adjustments. And that is expected because based on the current practice, the ROC adjustments are utilized when we reach certain levels of demand. Is when it becomes a concern of making sure that we have enough capacity to position the system towards the real-time accounting for the uncertainties that we have to deal with. And next slide, please. A different way to see this information would be by time of the day. And in this case, we organize this by year, but also by time of day, by hour of the day. And you can see that the trend is quite straight. Effectively, the ROC adjustments, at least for the last 3 years or so, have been mainly focused on ensuring we have enough capacity for the afternoon ramp and to cover the net and the gross peaks. And this is one of the critical pieces that I would like to emphasize later when we discuss the imbalance reserve, because this is very surgical, specific to the condition on ensuring that we have enough capacity position for the real-time market, granted, given the uncertainties that we have to factor in. Next slide, please. Now let's put 2 pieces together here. And one is the ROC adjustments that we know happen, and we are able to measure those over the last few years. And the other one is the imbalance reserve, because there is a discussion, right? If we're going to have these DayAhead market enhancements and we're going to rely on this product of imbalance reserve. The natural question that has been raised is how is it going to interplay with the rock adjustments? Well, the rock adjustment is generally only in the upward direction. It happens in the summer months and it's only for the peak hours. The rock adjustments are to deal with load uncertainty, but also for other type of operational uncertainties, as James explained earlier today. On the other end, you have the imbalance reserve that is systematically calculated for every single hour of the day, every single day of the year, and it's going to be in the upward and downward direction. So in this case, we are going to compare, just to try to put something apples to apples, we are going to compare and only the upward direction. And this upward direction is going to be correlated with the rock adjustments. And this specific metric only captures the instances in which the rock adjustments are greater than 0. There will be many cases if you put every single hour in which there will be an imbalance reserve, but there was no rock adjustment, such as in the winter months. So, and you can see in general, there is no correlation. If there is any, it will be very weak. And that's to a great extent expected, given how the constructs are at play. And by the way, there is another dimension that you can read in this plot, and that is the demand level. The color of the dots effectively tells you the demand level that we have in the system. And that is just to see if there is any type of association with the demand levels that we have in the system. As you can see, there is no correlation, or it's very, very weak, and that is expected. Now, let me go a little bit more on that. Next slide, please. This is the same information, but in a different concept. We're comparing the rock adjustments against how much of that rock adjustment is actually covered by the imbalance reserve. As you can see, the imbalance reserve is very good to cover any rock adjustments in the low range of the adjustments. And that makes sense because that is when we are really going to be comparing against the same level of uncertainties. Once we start going into higher rock adjustments, like 5,000, 6,000, this may introduce other operational uncertainty that the operators have to handle. And obviously, there will be not much correlation with the imbalance reserve because, again, the imbalance reserve is only for load, wind, solar uncertainties. And the color code as well tells you the forecast, the demand level. And it tends to be typically for a good coverage when you have these lower demand levels. And that makes sense. And that is when operators are going to go light in the rock adjustments. As we go and have higher and higher demand, you can see that the rock adjustment tends to be higher and the coverage of the imbalance is going to be lower. Next slide, please. Yes, Christina. Okay, let's take it.
Okay. Let's go to Michelle's question.
Thank you, Irma. This is Michelle again. Hey, I'm wondering if this is this sort of dovetails with our discussion earlier about exports. If part of the rock adjustments is to keep RA resources home and allow us to pull them back, doesn't this suggest that the imbalance reserve product won't work?
Can you expand on your conclusion, Michelle? I want to make sure I understand your sort of process.
Yeah, so you go through the IFM, and there are lots of self-scheduled exports. The rock adjustment keeps a lot of those exports, which would otherwise self-schedule out home, right? So it says, hey, we can't afford to export these, so we're not going to give them a day-ahead schedule. They can reschedule in the real time, and potentially we'll let them go. But so some portion of the rock adjustment could be to try to make sure that RA resources are not exported out of the system with the self-schedule. So I guess my point is, if that's true and you do imbalance reserves and you don't capture that, this was my point earlier, right? That you know, if you're exporting out of the system, won't you sort of decrease the reliability? So if the imbalance reserve doesn't capture that, which this illustration seems to be suggesting, then that means that we won't be able to keep the exports home in case of emergencies.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the key word, Michelle, if we keep it as is. As I indicated, we need to ensure that we are keeping the relative comparison between imbalance reserves and the current ROC construct, because these are not apples to apples, right? The ROC adjustments rely on load uncertainty plus operational uncertainties. The imbalance reserve is effectively under the framework of only load, wind, and solar uncertainties. It doesn't capture, under the current framework, any operational concerns or uncertainties that the operators have to deal. That would be something that is part of the consideration and the discussion that needs to take place, right? Whether there should be another mechanism, another way to internalize or to keep factoring in the operational uncertainties that are beyond load, wind, and solar. And now, just to rephrase the statement that you indicated, I wouldn't say that the ROC adjustments are for the purpose of keeping the array in place or to not give up too much exports. That's not the objective of the ROC adjustments. The objective of the ROC adjustments is to ensure we have capacity enough in the system to deal with the uncertainties. The mechanism of the market may land in different ways to achieve that. And one of those could be to reduce exports, but not for the sake of curtailing, but for the sake of ensuring the capacity is there. And once you go through the priorities and how the mechanism works in the market, that could be one of the consequences.
Right, but if an export, a self-scheduled export gets through the REC process, it gets day-ahead priority, so it gets priority overload, right? But if it doesn't get through the REC process, then all the other things apply that George was talking about, right? If it's low priority, we can pull it back. If it's high priority, it gets priority equal to load. But if it gets day-ahead priority, it's my understanding from the penalty parameters, it gets priority above load. And so that's why this is so critically important.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
That was changed. They don't. Yeah, the day-ahead REC exports don't get priority overload anymore. But okay, just to address your original point, I just wanted to address your original point that imbalance reserves will, in the IFM, will, to use your words, will perform the same function of keeping energy at home. The export won't get scheduled in the first place with imbalance reserves in the IFM versus the current method where when we're short, then RUC reduces the exports, then the exports are, that they're subject to being cut in real time. The imbalance reserves in the IFM would have the effect of not scheduling those exports in the first place, which, once we get into EDAM, seems to be a big advantage, because if we're going to rely on EDAM transfers, we would want the imbalance reserves to be in the IFM, so we're not scheduling infeasible EIM transfers. If we want to be able to count on the day-ahead results in EDAM, and then to the extent there's RUC adjustments, for example, for protecting lines in the case of fires, things like that Guillermo mentioned. Those things would still go on in RUC with imbalance reserves, because those kinds of things aren't factored into the imbalance reserve requirement.
Yeah, Brad, I totally agree with you. I guess the point is, though, the data that George is showing, or that Guillermo is showing here, show that at high levels of RUC adjustments, the imbalance reserves will not do it, right? Will not cover those high RUC adjustments, unless I'm misunderstanding this. Guillermo?
Yeah, no, what I was saying is that there are some specific day-to-day circumstances that are not covered in the imbalance reserve requirements, and that's probably what we're seeing in the chart. And those, we're not claiming that those RUC adjustments would not occur anymore. What we're saying is the systematic RUC adjustments that happen every single day would, that stuff would be incorporated in the imbalance reserve requirements, and those ruck adjustments would happen anymore, would decrease. But we're not saying that the operators would never adjust ruck anymore for specific circumstances that arise day to day that aren't in the imbalance reserve requirement.
Okay, so maybe what I'm hearing you say is that the imbalance reserve would capture some portion of this, but you would expect the operators to continue to make these adjustments in ruck.
I would address it similarly, Michelle, and I think the basis is that the imbalance reserve is comparable to the ruck adjustments as long as we are talking about the uncertainty that they are tackling, right? There are, as I indicated, other operational uncertainties that the operators have to materialize through the ruck adjustments. That inherently is not going to be part of this imbalance reserve because it's not part of the construct of the requirement.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have another question, Christina?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. And this is a good time to move into the next topic because it's related to the ruck adjustments, but it goes into the genesis of the values. And the ruck adjustments have been in place for several years. And it's not precise science. It's based on operator judgment, based on the conditions that they can size at the moment they have to make the decision. I would say for the last 2 years, we have tried to give a more scientific guide to these ruck adjustments. So we start estimating a historical upper confidence band. That is what we call. So we generate through the standard forecasting process a forecast for the day-ahead market. I would call this the 50-50 forecast, right? It's just based on all the methodology that we have for doing the forecasting based on weather conditions. Then we take all the most extreme cases that we have in history for similar weather conditions, and that is going to serve as an upper bound. That means it's going to give us a higher forecast. The difference between that higher forecast based on extreme conditions and the standard forecast that we generate day to day becomes what we call the upper confidence band. Is that additional incremental buffer that we assess if things were to play in the worst case scenario. And that is the additional information that serves operators as a guide of determining what the ruck adjustment could be. The trend that you have here is no more than the distributions of the upper confidence values that we have for the last 2 years. And it can be as high as 7,000 megawatts, as you can see in certain time of the year. And next slide, please. Now, let's do another type of correlation, and that is if we take the ruck adjustments and we compare that against the upper confidence band, that is a very conservative value. How that would correlate? Well, you can see that there is some level of correlation. The point may not be that obvious, but when you take the statistics, you are going to find that it is about 16% of the time that the ruck adjustments are basically the face value of the upper confidence band. There are other cases in which it's going to be higher or lower, depending on the date, the time of the year that you are dealing with. And this shows that, yes, there is a subset of ruck adjustments that effectively just take the face value of the upper confidence. But there are other conditions that influence the ruck adjustments that effectively go into the market, and that would be reflected in any other dot that is not in this perfect 45-degree line. Next slide, please. How would that look like if we were to take a snapshot of the critical days of summer 2021? This is just a 3-day period, and we compared 3 different items. One is the imbalance reserve, the second one is the ruck adjustment, and that may be factoring in the upper confidence, and then the explicit upper confidence that we estimated for operators' guidance. And there are a couple of things that you can realize from this comparison. The first one is that for these specific days, the upper confidence band basically overlaps with the rock adjustments. Effectively, for these peak hours, the operators are taking at face value the upper confidence and using it as the rock adjustment. And the other value, the other item that you can recognize here is that you just look at that, the magnitude, forget about the shapes, but just magnitude-wise, at least for July 8 and 9, and July 9 was the most critical day, you can see that the imbalance reserve requirement that we estimated with this approach is quite comparable to the value of the rock adjustment, and that is, let's say, for July 9, around 3,000 megawatts. The shapes are trickier because obviously the imbalance reserve is way more scientific in determining that, taking into account all the historical information, and the other ones are more rough approximations of only load. And next slide, please. Let me change a little bit in the context here of the discussion. And you may recognize this type of figure because we have presented this in the summer report. And this is a comparison between the supply and the demand that we have in the day-ahead market. The supply is organized in two main groups. One is the resource adequacy capacity, that is all the supply made available into the day-ahead market that is supported by resource adequacy resources. The portion in green is what we call the capacity above RA, and that means it's any capacity that is above the RA level or is associated with any resource that doesn't have any RA. And there is a series of trends in line to reflect the demand shape. We have the basic one, that is the dotted line, that accounts for the load forecast, only the natural load forecast of the day-ahead market, plus the obligation to meet the operating reserves. That will be the minimum requirements and obligation that we have to meet our demand. Then we have another comparison that uses instead the adjusted load forecast. Effectively, that is the day-ahead forecast plus the rock adjustments, and that is the one trended in blue. There is another one that we put for the comparison of the impact of the export service schedules, and that is the one in dark red, that adds on top of that the potential need to meet all the service schedule exports. And the new one that we have added here for this discussion is the one that takes into account only the load forecast, no adjustments, plus the obligation of operating reserves, plus the imbalance reserve, just to have a reference of how the requirements or the obligation for meeting demand in the day-ahead market will be under the construct of the imbalance reserve. So effectively, you can compare the line in blue versus the line in dotted yellow line to see under the current construct versus the imbalance reserve construct. And the scaling may not just this all the way, but you can see how these trends track to each other. And generally speaking, you can see that the imbalance reserve would impose a similar burden to the market in comparison to the current solution that we have of using the rock adjustments. Next slide, please. And let me pause here before we change discussion.
Let's see, I don't see anybody in the queue, but again, if you have a question, you can select the hand icon above the chat window. If you dialed in, press #2 or send your question in the chat. I don't see anybody in the queue, Guillermo.
Okay, I will hand it over to Quinn to go over the second part of the material, and that is related to the RUC process, the reliability unit commitment process that we have in the day-ahead market. And Quinn, are you there?
And Guillermo, we did get a chat question, sorry, while you were introducing Quinn. So Dave Francis asked, where can folks find the current and historical high confidence load forecast data?
That is not published. We were able to get this for this presentation. So if you go back to one of the decks, that would be the information that is right now available.
And let's see, Mike Castellano, sorry, Mike, let me go back to your questions. Mike asked if ISO is planning to publish the specification and results of the regression and use to calculate the requirements, including standard error calculations and other important details.
Yes, and the question may have come before I made the statement, but as part of this effort, we are also planning to put a white paper out indicating all the details and the methodology of the quantile regression applicable to the DayAhead market. And in that, we will have opportunity to assess the performance of the quantile regression. Some time ago, when we had the FRP enhancements, we posted one technical paper regarding the quantile regression for the real time. So currently we're working in one regarding the DayAhead. I don't have a specific date, but it's a work in progress right now.
Thank you, Guillermo. Okay, I don't see any other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, just to confirm, can you hear me okay? This is Quinn.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sure, okay, let's move on. So for this section, let's move on to focus on the rock solutions side. And before we dive into the slides, I'd like to start with a short introduction. We will analyze the RUC capacity by answering two questions. Number one, how rock solutions look like comparing to IFM? And number two, what volume is still available at RUC schedules? And we will focus more on the first one and briefly touch on the second. To answer the first question, we introduced this term, incremental rock capacity. As we talked about, IFM clears the market supply against bidding demand, while RUC clears the physical resources against load forecast. So starting with the IFM solutions, the rock paths will procure extra capacity or cut access supply where necessary, resulting in the schedule differences between IFM and RUC. So we call this schedule deviation the incremental rock capacity. In other words, it is the increased supply in rock or the delta change from IFM to rock schedules. Now, in the slide, we're looking at the hourly incremental rock capacity. And each data point here is the net change from RUC to IFM cleared per trade date, hour, and by the corresponding grouping type. And each box plot, the vertical box plot here, shows the distribution of the data from beginning of June 2020 through the end of September 2021 to cover the last two summers. As we can see, in majority of the hours, rock needed to secure more capacity on top of IFM and leading to the positive incremental rock capacity values. The incremental rock here is grouped by commitment status change from IFM to RUC. The blue boxes represents the rock deltas from resources that are already committed in IFM. For these resources, rock may incrementally change their dispatch levels while keeping their commitment status. And the pink boxes represent the deltas from resources that are committed in RUC but not in IFM. In these cases, rock may commit additional resources to procure sufficient capacity. And in general, we can see that incremental rock capacity is mostly supported by units already committed in IFM. And for hours ending 18 through 22, incremental capacity is largely supported by rock commitments. That's the peak afternoon hours. Next slide, please. Okay, this graph shows the incremental rock in a different breakdown, RA versus non-RA. The grouping should be self-explanatory. The blue boxes represent a rock delta under RA obligations, and the pink boxes represent the non-RA portion awarded in rock. So it's showing here incremental rock capacity is primarily supported by RA supply, which is expected. Next slide, please. Now, zooming into the tight supply days of July 2021, here for each day, we have 24 vertical bars showing the rock delta in each hour. Again, the blue area represents the data from units that are committed in IFM, and pink area represents the data from additional rock commitments. The rock deltas could be over 4,000 megawatts during the afternoon peak hours and were largely supported by additional rock commitments on these days. Next slide, please. So this slide maps out the contributions from different fuel types. Each plot here shows the monthly distribution of incremental rock capacity from one resource type. To name a few, we have bio, gas, coal, geothermal, etc., total of 12 categories. Note that the y-axis has a different range and scale in each plot. To point out a few observations here, first of all, we can see that gas, the first plot on the second row, that's gas, is providing the most significant share. And we included exports here in the upper right corner. The incremental rock in exports is how much the schedules got cut in RUC to align with the direction of increase in supply. And let's see, for batteries, that's the first plot on the third row. Since it can go both directions, a negative incremental rock could mean the resource charged more or discharged less in rock comparing to IFM. Okay, next slide, please. Again, going back to this past July, here is a breakdown of hourly rock delta by fuel types. And the gas resources in yellowish color were the main contributor, and exports, that's orange, might get cut during afternoon peak hours. So yeah, so that concludes the first topic. To recap, we looked at the incremental rock capacity broken down by commitment, by RA, and by resource types. The metrics covered the last 2 summers and a zooming period in the past July. Next slide, please. Yeah. After looking at the incremental rock, we wanted to know if there is still unloaded capacity left on top of rock schedule. And here we look at the rock ramp capability. To get a ramp capability, we take a resource that is already scheduled in rock, find out its max dispatch level considering the resource limitations, such as bid max, the ramp rates, the due rates, outages, and compare those with the rock schedule. And this plot shows the hourly ramp capability based on rock schedules. And you can see the ramp capability is high in the late morning to early afternoon hours, and the highest values in some cases are close to or about 4,000 megawatts. And the ramp capability reaches the minimum levels in the afternoon peak hours, close to 0 in some cases under tight system conditions. Again, since congestion, costs, and other constraints are not considered in this metric, eventually not all the ramp capability is accessible, and the aggregated volumes here reflect the flexibility of the system supply from the aspect of resource conditions. Next slide, please. Yes. This last slide shows the ramp capability from last July, adding one more dimension, the ramp rates. We took the ramp rates of the committed resource at their rock schedules and partitioned the range of ramp rates into buckets. So it shows how fast the ramp capability could be provided. For example, if we're looking at 10 megawatt per minute ramp rate, in 60 minutes, we can ramp up to 600 megawatts. And we can see that the ramp capability was mostly supported by resources having ramp rate below 50 megawatt per minute. And we have some capabilities from fast ramp resources during the afternoon peak hours. So that is the end of the section. Again, in the analysis report that is posted, we have more details on this analysis available. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Give it a moment, see if anybody has any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. I'm not sure, while people are queuing up, I'm not sure, James or Guillermo, if you have anything else you want to communicate to the group before I go to the next step.
Oh. James, not me.
Okay. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and go over the next steps, and I'll keep an eye on the queue just in case. So we are asking for written comments on the workshop, the materials, and the discussion. We heard a lot of comments today, some concerns. So if you can submit those in the tool, so the comments template will be available out on the initial webpage. Those are due by February 7th. As James mentioned earlier, we are planning to present to the MSC on February 11th. And the schedule is higher up in this presentation. And then targeting to publish the third revised straw proposal in April, early April. And then just to call attention to a new Energy Matters blog that the ISO published last week. The blog highlights the progress that's been made on the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative working group discussions that we launched the first week of January. So I did add the hyperlink here to that blog, and you can also find the blog from ISO's homepage. But just wanted to make you aware that we published that last week. You might be interested in that. We are hosting the Working Group 1 meeting later this afternoon, I believe 1 to 3. So if you are participating in that, you can find the information out on the ISO's public calendar. So any other questions before we conclude the call today? Alba, go ahead.
Hi, I'm actually, this is Alvis from PG&E. I'm actually registering that J.K. Wang has had her hand up for quite some time. She's speaking for PG&E this morning. Somehow you're not catching that she's been wanting to ask.
Sorry, I didn't see her, Alva. I saw her earlier, but it looked like she had lowered her hand. But happy to answer any questions that she has. She wants to queue up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. JK, do you want to raise your hand if you're still on? Excuse me. Here, oh, there she is. Okay, yeah, let's go to JK. JK, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, there you go. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. I just have a brief comment from PG&E. First of all, very appreciative CAISO putting this presentation together, and thanks for Guillermo's analysis and James walking us through the concept and motivation of jamming again. And we also appreciate the CAISO acknowledge the complexity issues that's intertwined with EDAM. So we have two brief comments from PG&E. First of all, PG&E believes DAM-E and EDAM are highly related and interdependent on each other. James gives us some presentations of the benefits of EDAM. However, we believe the benefits and the risks cannot be discussed in the context isolated from EDAM. We want to echo Jeff from SCE's concern. He mentioned how can the CAISO ensure the IRP that paid by California's customers are a contract stays in California. PG&E has shared with the CAISO a few examples on the risks when the DAM-E is implemented in EDAM. For example, with existing RA requirements of bidding at $0, RA will be exhausted in IFM, leaving zero capacity available for RUC, most likely. So as a California LSE, PG&E sees more risks of reliability instead of benefits in EDAM at this moment. And secondly, PG&E respectfully asked CAISO to develop these products in the context of EDAM if possible. We see some of the concerns from Michelle from CPUC that how the CAISO can ensure the real-time bit sufficiency given the transmission uncertainties. And we hope the CAISO can clearly define some assumptions of EDAM for the stakeholders to evaluate the next DME proposal. For example, how the RUG is run in EDAM. Will EDAM run the RUG in an extended manner as IFM? We basically evaluate the risks and benefits based on those assumptions. Those are very important for us. So from the perspective of project planning, we really believe CAISO should adopt more coherent approaches given the technical issues of DME and EDAMs are so intertwined. So we hope, and also based on the slides here, whether the current development approach can actually meet the target timeline without causing these significant market issues. We hope the CAISO can either considering given more time after EDAM's implemented and observing the results before start developing some of the key concepts in EDAM, where we should really, combine the technical issues in the same track. We understand, of course, there may be voting and filing complexities, and you do want to keep the two initiatives apart, but those technical issues shouldn't be discussed isolated. That's it.
JK, this is James, and thanks for your continued participation in this stakeholder effort. And I agree with a lot of what you said, and much of what you said is definitely on our radar. I think in terms of the DAME and EDAM connection, I think hopefully this workshop has done two things. One, for those that are participating in this call today that are more so participating to understand DayAhead market enhancements better, to prepare them to be a better participant in the EDAM process and have for the EDAM stakeholder process and have, based on this presentation, develop some foundational knowledge about what our vision is in terms of how they interact, so that we can, as we continue to develop the EDAM proposals within the EDAM working groups, that hopefully this workshop has provided those stakeholders a bit more of a foundation. And second, there are open questions, some of which that you highlighted and others on this call had highlighted about not just DayAhead market enhancements specifically, its design details, but its interactions with EDAM and other California resource adequacy rules and other things like that, we look forward to continuing to have further discussions and developments on those concepts as we put out future proposals and hold future workshops. So thanks again for your comments, and look forward to seeing them expressed in writing as well.
Thank you, James. We appreciate your explanations, and we look forward to working together with you.
Thank you.
JK. Alva, did you have something to follow up to JK, or did you just have your hand up from before? I want to make sure we don't close the call without addressing your question. No? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate your participation in the workshop today, and we look forward to your comments on February 7th. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.